The recent Biggest Loser documentary on Netflix really showed us what can be achieved when someone puts their mind and all the time and dedication into losing weight. But even some of the winners came out as losers, so really, was it as effective as it was meant to be? Or is there something deeply flawed about the Biggest Loser competition and how it was ran? My name's Clara and I'm an exercise psychologist and a personal trainer, and in this video I want to give you my personal insights based on my expertise on why I think that documentary highlighted some of the problems that so many people experience when trying to engage in long-term weight loss, and what you can actually do if you're trying to lose weight right now to mitigate some of those issues happening to you, and what you can do as a personal trainer or as a practitioner that is supporting somebody in losing weight at the moment to make sure that those mistakes don't get repeated. Some of the main points that I want to make about the show is that I don't think it properly addressed the fact that people had some serious mental health issues that may have probably led them to gaining weight in the first place. Not only that, but the people who were already on the show experiencing potentially some of these mental health difficulties were not appropriately safeguarded by the personal trainers and the coaches who were helping them lose this weight. And to make matters worse, the personal trainers on the show were shown many times trying to be or pretending to be pseudotherapists, which I think caused a lot more damage than good. So let's get into it. Before I start critiquing the show, I want to give you a bit of context as to why I'm making this video. So I'm an exercise psychologist, like I said, and a personal trainer, and I was inspired to pursue this career by watching shows similar to The Biggest Loser. But specifically, I started watching a show called Extreme Transformation Weight Loss Edition, which was ran by Chris Powell and Heidi Powell at the time. Now, I'd never had an interest in exercise. It had never really been something that was important or a relevant part of my life until the point in which I encountered this show. I started going to the gym, I'd started studying psychology, and watching that show on YouTube started to show me that there was something a lot deeper going on for people who found themselves in a position where they maybe had 200, 300, even 400 pounds of body fat to lose. And from that moment onwards, I realized that I wanted to be able to be the person who could help these individuals or these sorts of individuals with the psychology aspect of what it takes to lose a lot of body weight. Now, at the time, I decided to also become a personal trainer because I felt like having the dual careers would help me be able to support my clients even better. And what that's meant is that now, having worked in the fitness industry for over 8 years and having been practicing as a psychologist for over 4, I have a very good and in-depth understanding of both the psychology and the physicality of what it takes to lose body fat and to keep it off. And when it comes to critiquing shows like this one, the first thing we need to think about is, how does one become morbidly obese? Now, one of the things that I always talk about in my work, both as a psychologist and as a personal trainer, is that all behavior makes sense in context. So what this means is that nobody ever does things randomly. And I don't think, based on my experience, based on the research, that people who find themselves having gained such a significant amount of body fat ever do that just because they are hungry and because they have a lack of control around food. I do seriously believe that there is often much more deep-rooted issues that are maybe contributing to their eating behavior, and that eating or the food or even like the lack of exercise and the absence of exercise in their life is serving a deeper and more important or more nuanced function. So let's just say that someone has struggled to regulate their entire lives. Maybe they came from a really volatile background, and the only way that they were able to self-soothe when they were younger was by going into their room with a bar of chocolate, and that was how they learned to regulate their own emotions. You can very quickly understand or see how that behavior may have persisted throughout the rest of their lives in the absence of that person being taught any other self-regulation skills, how they will have continued to utilize food and more food as they have more access to it with money, with car and transport as they go into adulthood, how they would have very easily continued to access food as a means to self-regulate. The same goes for exercise, but slightly in a different way. You can see how if somebody has experienced a high amount of anxiety, as in like heart palpitations, elevated heart rate, sweaty palms, a lot of stress throughout their lives, and those things have come up for them when they've been in quite dangerous situations, again, perhaps being in a volatile home environment, you can imagine how having and noticing that anxiety experience, that physical experience of anxiety, could potentially bring up a lot of really intense memories for that individual, even if that physical experience is coming up for them in a situation that is so far removed from when they initially experienced it, such as when they're exercising. And so what this tells me as a psychologist is that very often when people eat, it's not because they're greedy, it's not because they're lacking in discipline, or when people avoid exercise, it's not because they can't be bothered. It's often because, especially to that extent, and that is the context here, it's often because there is something more deep, something more meaningful that has actually happened that is contributing or explaining why they find themselves in that situation. Now, this is where one of my biggest problems with the show comes up, and this is entirely based on the documentary because I haven't actually watched watched a ton of the Biggest Loser shows. I think that the personal trainers that were running the show and who were supporting the staff members, the cast members, or whatever they want to call them, the participants, that they had an awareness based on their experience, based on what they were seeing, that the people who were on their show who found themselves with 300-400 pounds of body fat to lose actually had a lot of the psychological baggage that they were carrying. So these personal trainers had an awareness of that. However, their lack of qualifications in supporting people with these sorts of issues, by no fault of their own, like they're personal trainers, they're not supposed to know this stuff, meant that although they had an awareness of it, they weren't actually able to tackle it. Now, this presents two problems to us. The first one is that in having an awareness but not having the skill or the training to tackle a particular issue, what these PTs found themselves was engaging in pseudotherapy, as some of the contestants spoke about in the documentary, which is incredibly precarious because although often this pseudotherapy is done without the intention to harm, it is still very, very harmful because it's very easy to open up boxes, but it's incredibly difficult to close them back and to make sure that somebody's left psychologically safe after those boxes have been opened. And I don't think the personal trainers were going out of their way to deliberately harm their clients, but very often, and it happens all the time in the fitness industry, coaches try to be helpful and coaches try to do a good job by supporting their clients by having really difficult conversations about emotions, about the past, about traumas. But in trying to be helpful, they're actually becoming more unhelpful because they are putting their clients in precarious positions, psychologically speaking, that might then actually trigger them to overeat, to under-exercise, or to even over-exercise at times. The second issue with these personal trainers not being qualified in addressing these psychological issues is that although they had an awareness, they weren't perhaps able to appreciate how this psychological baggage might be impacting on someone's behavior. And there was quite a few examples in the show where a woman was shown to really be struggling to complete an exercise. She was shown struggling to finish a bout of exercise for 30 seconds. She kept kind of giving up, and this particular personal trainer in that instance loses their fucking shit on her. Now, context, it's TV, I get that, but had somebody given them that psychological training, or had that person had the psychological training, they would have never ever responded in that particular way, because that could again be incredibly triggering for this individual. And we don't know what it is that comes up for her or for anybody when they are exercising, when they are pushing themselves to that edge that might make everything within them just pull the brakes and stop them from exercising completely. So without the appropriate training, a personal trainer is not able to appropriately appreciate what the impact of even weight loss or engaging in weight loss practices or engaging in exercise might be for an individual, and why that person might find it incredibly hard to either adhere to a diet out with the show, especially because, as we could see, a lot of those behaviors and the changes didn't persist beyond the show, but also within it, which is incredibly problematic when we're then trying to encourage people to lose weight, especially using some of the quite extreme measures that they were using on the show. And by extreme, I just mean the fact that like these people were literally living and training as athletes, and that is not something that is sustainable or realistic for anybody, certainly not those participants once they left the show, which again bears the question of, are we really making a show about helping people lose weight and maintain that, or are we just making good TV? Which again, obviously from the show we could see that it was just about making good TV and that they didn't give a fuck about people's well-being. So there's that. Another huge issue I have with not just shows like this, but generally when people kind of engage in weight loss competitions, is that it's a very reward or punishment based incentive. Now, everything that you will ever read about motivation will tell you that having rewards or punishments as a consequence to completing a behavior or doing something is incredibly detrimental to long-term motivation, because it really taps into our extrinsic reasons for doing something. It takes us away completely from connecting with our deeper reasons, our deeper values for why we might choose to intentionally lose weight. And in this case, we saw it, I forget the name of the gentleman who won this competition but then regained all of his weight and some. We saw that because the reward became more important than anything for him within that weight loss contest, he was willing to do whatever it took. He was willing to fast, he was willing to do, to take caffeine pills, he was willing to completely utterly restrict his food intake to an extreme that just was clearly not healthy nor sustainable for him. And again, had the show had a bit more of a psychological appreciation, or even had they hired a psychologist on site, which obviously is like would have never happened in the early 2000s, but Had they had somebody like that on set alongside the medical doctor that was there, I am certain of the fact that those behaviors would have been checked straight away, because that is incredibly disordered, and that is literally a highway to disaster. It's a highway to fucking button pressing. It's a highway to self-sabotage. It's a highway to regaining all the weight that one would have lost in that show, simply by virtue of the show being predicated upon winning some money and then also being punished for not, completing, not achieving weight loss, such as when they, were standing in front of everybody and getting weighed in. That's just such a shame-based experience for absolutely anybody who's ever been in like that type of horrific situation. That it's unsurprising that people were not able to maintain those behaviors after the show. I think it's also really problematic because it really does breed this kind of perfectionism, this all or nothingness, that like if you're not doing everything in your power to lose weight, you're basically a piece of shit. And again, the personal trainers behaving the way that they behaved essentially reinforced that on the show, which again I think is why it explains the fact that so many people were just simply not able to maintain those changes after the show terminated. I know I've just made this point, but I do not know if the show actually had any appropriate mental health screening. I'm going to assume that it didn't, because my sense that if it did, they would have probably flagged up a lot of participants that simply would have not been allowed to take part. If the show did have a mental screening and they still let participants come onto that show with some of the baggage and some of the context that they were bringing into it, then that tells us everything we need to know about how fucked up helping people on the telly, pseudo helping people on the telly, really is. And I guess it really just helps understand why psychologists and therapists and counselors work in such confidential and in such safeguarded spaces, because putting someone who's got a lot of mental health baggage in that type of like high pressured situation is just probably the worst thing that you could probably do to them. And the audacity to call it, an attempt at help is just, it's disgusting, to be completely honest. And it's abhorrent, and again, unsurprising that people struggled as much as they did. Considering mental health factors when engaging in intentional weight loss is probably one of the most important and overlooked things that is done most commonly in the fitness industry. And I think it is why we continue to see that individuals, by no fault of their own, find themselves repeating the same cycle of gaining and losing the same 10, 15, 20 kilos over and over throughout their lives, until they get to a point in which they are so morbidly obese and they are having all of these clinical problems that they, feel like they are broken, that there's something deeply wrong with them, that they feel like there's not going to be anything that they can do for themselves. And kind of more recently, we're seeing that is perhaps when people feel the pressure to, try weight loss medications, to perhaps have an operation that might be able to assist with the tackling of obesity as a disease for them. And I just think that not having that mental health appreciation of how and why somebody finds themselves in a position in which they have overeaten and not exercised to the point of gaining such a substantial amount of body fat, it's just, oh my goodness. I think we're doing everybody who struggles with obesity such a huge disservice by not honouring the fact that it is so much deeper than simply an inability to control oneself around food. It's just, I could talk about this for hours, but I don't want to make this YouTube video too long. And I do have some more notes that I want to cover in line with the whole argument of these changes intending to be sustainable, but quite clearly not being sustainable. One of the things that I have found most effective in my practice is leading with compassion. And I know that compassion sounds really icky, and compassion is probably the opposite of what we witness as personal trainers engaging in the show with the clients that were showcased. Again, I appreciate that some of the people who were on the show absolutely adored their personal trainers and found such a meaningful connection with them, and it was really, really helpful for them. But more often than not, these sorts of programs and these sort of weight loss programs, just more generally, like in the fitness industry, are not based on principles of compassion. And when I talk about compassion, what I mean is kindness. What I just mean is basic respect, not just going off discipline because you have to do it, because you've got this like deepened sense of obligation of I must do it at all costs, and or else there's going to be a negative consequence. Compassion helps us engage in intentional weight loss from a place of really wanting something better for ourselves, because we may be able to appreciate the fact that carrying an excess amount of body fat is negatively impacting on our lives, is negatively impacting on our confidence, it's negatively impacting on our self-esteem, on a whole array of issues. And I'm not here to shame anybody who wants to intentionally lose weight. I am just here to talk about how problematic it is when we try to engage in intentional weight loss from a place of self-criticism, from a place of self-disgust. Now, of course, a lot of people who find themselves carrying an excess amount of body fat experience a lot of shame and a lot of self-criticism and a lot of self-directed disgust, again by no fault of their own, because we live in such a society that has fat shamed the shit out of fucking everybody around, right? So it is so normal that people struggle with these things, and it is so normal that the only way that they know to engage with weight loss is by coming at it from a place of self-directed shame and criticism. But it is just not an effective technique, because inevitably with all that pressure, all those perfectionistic and rigid standards that come with being so critical of oneself, and generally with being so critical of oneself, of one's engagement in intentional weight loss practices, the moment that we see ourselves failing or falling back into old habits, it is so much easier to just press the fuck it button and to just bin it off, because you can't feel like a failure when there are no standards to be met. And that is why I think compassion is the key to breaking some of these things, because when we can lead with compassion, it is a lot easier to pick up the pieces and not feel so much like a failure when we do have many slip-ups off the back of just being human. And that's exactly how I work, and that's why I talk all the time about the importance of compassion, about the importance of values. And if you want to learn a bit more about how I work and how I implement these things with my clients, then check the links in the description of this video, because you'll find everything you need to learn in there. So anyway, I know this is quite a long video and there's so much more that I feel like I could say, but the main takeaways for me from the show, and that I hope that you can take away from this video too, is that obviously it was done for TV. I know that, and I know when things are done for entertainment, people's well-being and people's care is simply not accounted for. We've seen that in so many reality TV shows. It's actually ridiculous. Basically, what I want you to remember is that if you want to intentionally lose weight, and if you want to engage in intentional weight loss practices, make sure that you are checking in with yourself, and that you're doing this from a place of wanting to take care of yourself and not from a place of hating yourself. I'm not saying gaslight yourself into liking yourself. I'm just saying honor the fact that perhaps right now it feels quite critical, and you can do a lot of work around self-compassion to be able to change that, because when you change that is when that weight loss becomes sustainable and maintainable, which is the most important thing. The second thing I will say is that if you're working with a personal trainer or a coach right now, and if they're engaging in pseudo-therapy with you, be really fucking careful. I'm not going to tell you to stop working with them, because that's entirely up to you, but just be really careful, because as much as they might be intending to help you, they could be causing more harm than good. And if you're a personal trainer or a practitioner who supports people with weight loss, but you're not a trained counselor or therapist, be very, very, very careful of your misplaced intentions to help, because when you start crossing the line and pretending to be a therapist, you could be causing your clients so much more harm than good, and I'm sure that's not what you want to be doing. And just as a parting note, if you've been struggling with intentional weight loss for your whole life, if you've carried an excess amount of body fat for your whole life, it's literally not your fault. I know there are so many more contributing factors that may explain how and why you've ended up in this position, and it's okay. It really isn't your fault, but if you do want to do something, it is your responsibility to do that and to take action, but do that from a place of compassion. So anyway, I hope that this video gave you a bit of insight as to how an exercise psychologist and qualified personal trainer thinks about this documentary, about the show, and about generally intentional weight loss practices in the fitness industry. And if you liked it, please drop a like and a comment, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.